Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today is the last lecture in the course, and what I hope to do in the body of the lecture is to begin with telling you the major challenges that we face as a human community in terms of development. And these challenges are palpable and understood to be there at the global, regional, and national levels. And to identify those challenges and show that the kind of methodology that we adopted in trying to understand those challenges and finding a way to address them at the level of public action, public policy, and action by citizens. I'll then trace what I think were the major themes of this course and indicate what kind of relationship there is between those three themes. Normally those themes don't get taught, at least not in a course on development, but much less is the relationship between those themes considered. So that's what I'll do in this later part of this lecture, is to trace the three major themes that ran through this course and to see what the relationship was between them. But before I begin all that, I'd like to start with a kind of personal note and to share with you what teaching means to me. Many of you may become teachers later, who knows, and many of my young colleagues in the faculty who are already teaching, mashallah, may be interested at some point in finding out what this old man thinks of teaching. I think the teacher makes a humble contribution to the intellectual development of his students. This is a contribution to the highest faculty that God has granted to a human being. That is the faculty of the intellect. I use the term intellect here in its ancient sense, which is, whether it's in the Western tradition or in the Eastern tradition, the intellect is understood as having two aspects. One is that it's an instrument of experiencing the transcendent. Your sense of beauty, your sense of the ultimate truths are subject to being experienced in a direct way through the intellect. So that's why it's called the intellect originates from the word intellectus, which means the instrument of experiencing the transcendent. The intellect is also historically used synonymously with the term heart, which we'll discuss during this lecture. The other aspect of the intellect, which the Greeks first discovered, was that it consists in trying to understand reality. You also use reason. So the intellect, in a sense, one can argue, combines reason with the capacity for experiencing the transcendent. The Greeks used the word nous, N-O-U-S, which was reason combined with the experience of the transcendent truths. And these truths include, for example, love, compassion, beauty, truth. Plato called beauty the splendor of truth. So, and he's considered beauty as truth and truth beauty. So these truths are accessible if you discipline yourself in a certain way to the intellect. But at the same time, reason becomes very important to understand the world around us and to get to a point where you can make that leap into direct experience. That is the sense in which I was suggesting that one was trying to make a humble contribution to the development of your intellect. That's the sense in which it is actually the highest faculty of being human. Now, to be able to teach, and I'd like my colleagues to know this too, to be able to teach in the sense that I've just described, it's necessary for the teacher to be able to give the students a sense of the excitement of discovery. Both discovery of the way the world is and also a discovery of the way the world should be, ought to be. And the way the world ought to be involves an experience of what it is to be human. And so the teacher, to be able to give that kind of sense of excitement of discovery, has to be able to undertake scholarship and research at the cutting edge of knowledge in that field. And at the same time, the teacher has to be engaged in an inner journey of knowing herself or himself, the inner journey to the heart. Okay, so now what's the heart point? The sense in which the heart and the intellectus are being used synonymously in classical literature. And the perennial tradition, whether of religion or wisdom traditions, in both the East and the West. The heart, one, as Professor Hussain Nasser has suggested, is the site, S-I-T-E, is the location of, it's that space where the human realm and the divine realm meet. That is a space within you, the merely human is able to rise to a point where she or he is able to experience God or the ultimate truths and the ultimate beauty of existence. That is so, in many ways, the inner journey, the journey of the intellectus, of the experience of the transcendent, is a journey to the heart. That's the sense in which it's a journey to the heart. Because the heart is supposed to be the space, that location, that site, where the human and the divine realms come together. So the teacher, in nurturing the intellect of the students, and remember, each student, you'll know this when you know each other, and you'll know this when in case you teach. Each student is unique. That's the beauty of it. Each individual is infinitely unique. Each individual has a kind of unique, infinite qualities granted by God. And so, the teacher, in nurturing the intellect of the students, experiences the breathtaking beauty of students as they blossom. It's the blossoming of the students in which the teacher both contributes and partakes of. That is, if you think about it, a breathtaking beauty. But there are more than one students. So now how do we deal with that? before we go into the neuroscience of dealing with students, let me just propose that nurturing the intellect is essentially an act of love. It is possible to nurture love only if you have love in your heart for the students. You've got to be able to reach them in some way, and to be able to stimulate them, to be able to excite them into discovering new things about their subject and about the world and about themselves. So nurturing the intellect is an act of love, and this is why I keep saying that since this is going on in a classroom, this awesome process is taking place in a classroom, the classroom is therefore sacred. It's a sacred space where the highest faculty of the human being is being cultivated through an act of love. And the sanctity of that space, as all sacred spaces, requires discipline and a constant access to your highest aspects of your reason and a constant access to your heart. That's the beauty of it. Okay, what's the neuroscience of it? You know, one very interesting thing that neuroscientists have discovered, you don't need to look at the slide right now. One interesting thing that neuroscientists have discovered is that the brain of human beings is unwired at birth. There's a large number of neurons that are lying around. They're like wires, each the individual neuron, but they're unwired, they're unconnected, largely. We have only a few connections at birth, a neural connection, like drinking the mother's milk and crying when you're hungry and that kind of thing. Or smiling when you are able to get enough food to eat. But the brain is largely unwired at birth. And what happens is that through the process of learning, we form those neural connections. So you're literally constructing your own brain in the process of learning. And remember what I told you at the beginning of this course is that when learning occurs at the neural level, what's happening is that two neurons which were not connected before get connected. An electrochemical impulse passes through the two neurons. That connection is called a synapse. And if you put an MRI machine, link up an MRI machine with the person's head who was in the process of learning, you'll discover that each time there is a neural connection, i.e. an idea gets formed, a new idea comes to you. Each neural connection, when it occurs, there's a spark, an electrochemical spark in the brain which can be captured in an MRI machine. Now, do you know the number of sparks that you can generate? The number of neural connections that you can form? It's 10 to the power of 21. 10 with 21 zeros in front, or 1 with 21 zeros in front. Right? Now that is a kind of million billion possible neural connections that you can form in your own brain. And you may be interested in knowing that 10 to the power of 21 is also the total number of stars in the universe. So what's happening in the class when the teacher is addressing it? If he's doing his job, his or her job, is helping form those neural connections. And if you think about it, the teacher is gazing during the process of teaching at the splendor of new universes emerging. Each individual is a universe, has 10 to the power of 21 million possible connections, the 10 to the power of 21 possible sparks that you can generate in the process of learning, which is the total number of stars in the universe. So that's why I said, when you look at students as a teacher, you actually are experiencing the splendor of new universes taking shape. You've got a ringside seat across the cosmos, which is the classroom. This unique universe within each student affirms the beauty and truth of the universes outside. So the universe within affirms the truth and beauty of the universe without. Okay, that ends my initial personal sort of statement of what teaching means to me. In summary, it's a sacred act, teaching, because in a very humble fashion, the teacher is contributing to the development of the two great capacities of the human being, the capacity to reason and the capacity to experience the ultimate truths, the metaphysical truths. It's in bringing the two together that human innovation and human creativity emerges. Creativity is also a God-given capability to human beings. And when you combine reason with love, then you're able to create and innovate. And that is why human beings, as they wire their own brain, as they learn, they become great problem solvers. Through human beings have survived over the last 200,000 years as Homo sapiens. As a species, we're probably 2 million years old. You know, you had the earlier Peking man and the Neanderthal man and so on. But for the last 200,000 years, the Homo sapiens have been able to survive because they were able to learn, they were able to form connections between the neurons in their own brain, and that process of learning enabled them to combine reason and love and thereby create and innovate. And it is through human creativity and human innovation that we are not only able to survive, but to enrich the world with our presence. Now, as far as the course itself is concerned, it attempts to provide the analytical and the intellectual basis, intellectual in the sense that I just mentioned. The course attempted to provide the analytical and intellectual basis for addressing three key challenges that confront the human community, that confront the world, whether at the global level, the regional level, or the national levels. And what are those three challenges? The first obvious one is the environmental crisis. This is a crisis that has now been recognized as being a threat. It constitutes a threat to the life support systems of the planet. The second challenge is the growing inequality that places increasing stresses on the very fabric of society. Inequality. Inequality not just in the economic sense, but also in the social sense. There are many dimensions of inequality, of opportunity. In terms of certain religious denominations not having the same access over opportunity as other religious denominations may have. Certain ethnic denominations may not have the same opportunities as others have. Certain linguistic identities may not have the same access over opportunities as others may have. Gender also is a great separate. Gender also in many societies is asymmetric. Some, the men enjoy in many societies better opportunities than women do. So there's a whole range of inequalities that is not only there, persisting, but is actually growing across the world. Particularly economic inequality is growing. And as it grows, it places, as I said, stresses on society that threaten its fabric. It can rupture the fabric of society. People, in a globalized world, when you have globalized media, are not going to tolerate this kind of inequality of opportunity for very long. And when they rise, they threaten the fabric, then the very fabric of society, which is organically unequal, will be threatened, will be ruptured. The third challenge is widespread violence. And this widespread violence undermines the stability of state structures and political systems. So we have these three challenges: the threat to the life support system of the planet, growing inequality of opportunity, and widespread violence. Now, what we did in this course of lectures, and we attempted this together, was to develop a new analytical understanding of these challenges, both individually and in terms of the relationships between these three challenges: the crisis of the environment, the inequality, and violence. We developed the analytical tools, the analytical basis of understanding these challenges and their relationship, the relationship between them. We also, hopefully, began a journey through which we can re-experience what it is to be human. That's an experience. Now, fundamentally, the experience of being human is the experience of human compassion, compassion towards others, a sense of loving care, rahm. God, the one attribute in terms of which God describes himself most frequently in the Holy Quran, is Rahman ar-Rahim. And rahm, the root of the word rahma, the Arabic root, Syriac root of rahm, is rahma, which means the mother's womb. So God's compassion does not arise out of pity. God's mercy doesn't arise out of pity. It arises out of love, loving care. Right? And that is a God-given capability which has been lying dormant now for almost 300 years. And what we attempted to do, as I said, was on the one hand to develop cutting-edge analytical tools to understand the three challenges we've just identified and the relationships between them. And on the other hand, we undertook a journey, maybe at differing speeds amongst different students. We undertook a journey, essentially a journey of becoming. We undertook a journey of re-experiencing compassion. Now, the reason why we did that, I tried to do that and bring that into the course, was based on my view that public policy and public action so far to address the three crises that we just discussed, the crisis of the environment, the crisis of climate change right now specifically, the crisis of inequality, and the crisis of violence, that public policy has been grossly inadequate, far from even approaching the achievement of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. We are moving in the opposite direction. The carbon emissions have been rising at the rate of 5.3% annually since 1960, right up to 2019 today. Right? But if we are to reach zero emissions by the year 2050, which is the commitment made by all the countries of the world or all the signatories to the Paris Agreement, then we'll have to start moving in the opposite direction, which is to start reducing emissions, carbon emissions, by 3% annually. Now, this failure to meet an agreed target of emissions doesn't arise simply out of lack of technology or opportunities or techniques. Fundamentally, it arises out of a particular kind of consciousness where every individual wants his or her material acquisitions to increase rapidly. And as a result, therefore, nation states, by and large, also want, as nation states, to achieve a higher and higher rate of increase of goods and services available to their people. And that kind of consciousness, therefore, it's another kind of relationship associated with the relationship with commodities, is a relationship with nature, where we see nature roughly as a kind of set of natural resources. We see nature in fragmented terms. Trees are wood, it's a resource, wood, we can make furniture out of it, out of them. Water systems are useful because we can either generate electricity, we can irrigate our fields, and we can bottle the water and sell it. Other human beings are also seen as competitors, just like other nations are seen as competing for superior access over these natural resources, where nations and individuals, as I said, are engaged in the constant struggle to have a larger and larger volume of goods and services available to them. So we have a particular relationship with other human beings where we see them as a threat or as an instrument of achieving our goals. We have a particular relationship with nature, which we see as a fragmented set of natural resources. And we see commodities as the emblem of gratification, as the receptacles of qualities that we were supposed to have organically, as a receptacle of qualities of success, of status, of sexuality, of power, of beauty, all qualities which human beings essentially possess themselves, have been transposed into commodities. And we are made to believe that, and we are convinced that these commodities are what contain these qualities of success and power and status. So we have these specific kinds of relationships between individual human beings and nations, between human beings and nature, and between human beings and commodities. And the point that we tried to introduce was to say that these relationships were not always there and don't always have to be there in the future. These are relationships that emerged in a specific period in history, under a specific mode of production, that induced this kind of consciousness. And so, what were the themes that we looked at? There were broadly three themes. First was the theme of development itself. What is development? We started with that in the first module. And that set the stage for the end of the course. where at the end of the course we examined this question of what is development. We try to answer it by designing a particular kind of development strategy for Pakistan. We came up with an idea of what development should be and how can it be achieved. Right? But the question was raised in the first module, what is development? And there were two major concepts of development that we looked at some length and hopefully some depth. The first was human development, Sen's idea of human development. That ultimately, and it is in a sense a very simple proposition which is shockingly new, but is also very old, because the Greeks were familiar with it. As I said, in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle said that goods, he was talking about value, goods cannot be of value because they're merely useful. What is of value is human functioning. Now, Sen picks up this idea from Aristotle and converts it into an economic, into the concept of, the contemporary concept of human development, where he talks about fulfilling those material conditions that will enable human beings to function and be able to have the choices on the basis of which they can live a kind of life which the individual feels is meaningful. Right? And so we looked at the idea of human development. And in looking at that idea of human development and looking at the intellectual origins of that idea in Aristotle, we discovered that actually Sen was missing out a very important dimension of the concept of human development. And that is a missing dimension that now has to be brought back if we are to save the world and ourselves. And that missing dimension was a dimension of human consciousness. Remember that in the same passage where Aristotle talks about goods not being of value and what is of value he thought was human functioning, in that passage he asks, and what is human functioning? This is what Sen ignores. What is human functioning? And he says human functioning is functioning according to the principles of virtue. One fundamental virtue is loving care towards others, empathy. That's a defining feature of being human. Functioning according to the principles of virtue. And then he goes on to say that functioning according to the principles of virtue corresponds to the logic of the soul. So Aristotle talks about the very structure of the soul. And he says that the soul has a propensity, is designed to be able to live a life of virtue. That is why both Aristotle and Socrates believed that satisfaction, when somebody asked Socrates, Socrates, why should we live a life of virtue? You keep saying this. When by being dishonest and by deceiving people and being aggressive towards other people, I can become very rich. I can have lots of goods. So Sen said, Aristotle said yes, Socrates said yes, you'll get satisfaction from wealth. But there is also the satisfaction of the soul. And you can get the satisfaction of the soul by living a life of virtue, not necessarily by collecting goods. So Socrates, which then went on to Aristotle picked that up. Socrates is essentially talking about, and so was Aristotle, talking about two different levels of satisfaction. There's a satisfaction that comes from material possessions and goods and services. It enables you to function. But then there is also the satisfaction of the soul. Now the soul, now you'll ask the question, what is the soul? The soul, like the heart, so you can use it synonymously, is not simply the organ by that name, the heart. It is the deepest point, deepest part of human consciousness. It is the center of human consciousness. Just as the heart is the center of the body, supplies blood to the whole body, takes up blood that's impure, and then after it's been purified through the lungs, it sends it around to every cell of the body. So the heart is, in a sense, the center of the human body. These great philosophers, both of West and East, thought of heart as being the center of human consciousness. And that center of human consciousness, the heart that they're talking about, is that space where the human and the divine realms meet through the bridge of love, of loving care. Now we explored this theme in the subsequent modules. The theme began with doing a critique of Sen's conception of human development, or trying to enlarge Sen's conception of human development. The second thing we looked at in the first module was the idea of sustainable development. Now, sustainable development, in a strange way, is linked with the idea of human development, as we've just discussed, in the broader sense of human development. Because sustainable development means that development which enables the present generation to fulfill its needs without undermining the capacity of future generations to fulfill their needs. So, in other words, for the first time in the history of development, ideas or economics, it was proposed that human beings have a sense of the individual human being has a sense of responsibility towards human beings who are yet to be born. There's a particular relationship with the future that human beings have. They don't just live in the present. They live in the future too, through their progeny and through other generations. And they owe responsibility to the future generation. Now, if they owe a sense of responsibility to generations yet unborn, then they certainly, ipso facto, one can argue, owe a sense of responsibility to the existing generations who are deprived, the existing members of our community who are deprived as a result of inequality and poverty. And that is why overcoming poverty and reducing inequality are as vital an aspect of sustainable development as is the protection of the environment. You see this in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Right? Okay, so we looked at these two concepts and developed these two concepts, human development and sustainable development, and ended up by saying that both human development in the broader sense of the term of developing a humane consciousness of compassion, and development as sustainable development requires a particular consciousness of the relationships between human beings and also between human beings and nature. And as a consequence, we have to redefine our relationship with commodities, that the production of which intervenes into both our relationship with nature and our relationship with other human beings. So now that opens up a new kind of agenda of investigation and learning, right? And we argued that this question of developing a humane consciousness, whether you approach it in terms of human development or you approach it in terms of sustainable development, either way is a vital requirement. The rediscovery of empathy and compassion, which are so basic to being human and have been lost in the last 300 years, that rediscovery is vital if we are to save the life support systems of the planet, if we are to save societies from being ruptured apart by inequality, if we are to save political systems and state structures from being destabilized through widespread violence. Compassion becomes an important driving force of public policy for building a more humane world, a more humane nation, a more humane region. Okay, so then we tried to explore these three very important relationships between humans and humans, between humans and commodities, and between humans and nature. And in trying to explore these relationships, we examined the structure and dynamics of the capitalist mode of production. We showed that it has three fundamental tendencies, structural tendencies at a technical level. These are the three design features, if you like, of the world capitalist system. The first is that there is a continuous tendency for the volume and range of output of goods and services to increase. The volume and range of goods and services tends to increase. That tendency arises out of the fact that individual capitalists are pitted in competition with each other. And for the individual capitalist, the imperative of survival is to enlarge the profits. And how does he enlarge the profits? He or she enlarges the profits by reinvesting his profits back into expanded production. So that's the first tendency. That's rooted in the very structure. As Marx said, the individual, the immanent laws of capitalist production, make themselves felt as external coercive laws to the individual capitalist. So the individual capitalist feels it as an imperative of survival to continuously reinvest, produce more and more, and enlarge his profits. So the second tendency is that when you're reinvesting, it involves technological change. So for the first time in history, knowledge began to be systematically mobilized and deployed by the individual producer, by the individual capitalist, for the enlargement of profit. So we have technology as the tendency for continuous improvements in technology is a second very important structural feature of capitalism. And out of that came the idea of a kind of linear progress. We understood progress in terms of continuous changes in technology for the production of more and more goods. There is a linear progress taking place. The third tendency was obviously if you are continuously increasing the volume and range of production as a matter of survival of the individual capitalist, then at the aggregate level you're going to have a rather continuous increase in volume and range of goods. The problem is how do you convert that into profit? But you can only do that by selling those products. You're under pressure to sell the products you produce. And so these large firms, by the time they became large, could only survive on the basis of sales efforts to sell their goods. And if everybody was engaged in that, a new kind of culture emerged, a new set of values had to emerge, right? So the capitalist system, again I was quoting Marx, not only produces goods that satisfy needs, it also produces the needs which these goods satisfy. So the process of continuous expansion of goods and services was associated with not only continuous technological change, but also a continuous and systematic effort to create the needs which those goods would satisfy. And hence, a particular kind of relationship emerges between individuals who are competitive, aggressive, see others as a threat or as a means to your end. A particular kind of relationship emerges with commodities, where you see commodities, as I said, as a receptacle of metaphysical qualities which they don't actually objectively possess. And third, is that we developed a particular relationship with nature, a kind of exploitative relationship. We fragmented the essential wholeness of nature and saw it in terms of individual resources to be exploited. Nature was to be exploited and brought into the service of production and profit. Now, the point is that these three relationships which in many ways constitute the architecture of the modern mind, where the human being has become estranged from his essential self. If you see his essential self as being one that relates itself with nature, with other human beings, with all creatures, a human being experiencing her or himself as in terms of loving care towards others, our consciousness was estranged from that essential feature, and we became, in a sense, subject to the imperatives of continuous increase in production. We saw other human beings in terms of competition and aggression. We saw commodities as being something metaphysical and therefore to be constantly owned, and more commodities were to be owned. The kind of non-cessibility emerged. And thirdly, we got alienated from nature as well, where we tried to violate nature in the interest of service, of capital, of profit. We then counterposed this particular kind of architecture of human consciousness that emerged under capitalism with an alternative consciousness that is perhaps dormant in us, but which was there through the ages and can be seen in all the religions and all the wisdom traditions of the world. We explored those relationships and showed that commodities were seen in the old world as being merely useful. As Aristotle said, commodities cannot have value because they're merely useful. Right? And so commodities, the status of a person was determined not by so much by what he or she owned, but by what he or she gave away to others. That was the base of status. In other words, what was being emphasized in terms of value and status was the relationship between human beings, their responsibility towards each other, their sense of loving care for each other. That is what was the centerpiece of human functioning. Similarly, our relationship with each other in the old world was not one of seeing others as threats or as instruments of achieving our material goals. The other was seen as an essential fertilizing force in the growth of the self. It was by bringing the other within the self and recognizing that the needs of the other are more important for me than my own needs, or at least just as important. That experience of the other, of internalizing the other within ourselves, within our consciousness, served to enhance ourselves, made us bigger selves. What the Western psychologists called the ego, which is an element of the conscious mind, and the idea of a preoccupation with the concerns of the ego, hence egocentric. In the perennial intellectual tradition, it was through the transcendence of the ego that you were really able to develop as a human being. that you were able to achieve a selfhood that was much larger than the self that enclosed the ego. Similarly, we looked at nature in the perennial tradition. Nature was actually seen in terms of a sacred wholeness. Nature was seen as modern scientists do, that nature is part of it's an ecosystem where everything is related with everything else in nature. The trees, the rain, the water, the soils, the oceans, the winds are all interlinked within a delicate ecosystem, as modern scientists call it. And that ecosystem is responsible for reproducing human and the life of all creatures, because it's able to give us fresh water to drink, fresh air to breathe, and soils, fertile soils through which to grow crops and function. Now, in the old tradition, nature was seen in a dual sense, that on the one hand, nature enabled us surely to reproduce our lives, physical lives. We were able to eat, drink, and breathe because of the wholeness of nature. But the wholeness of nature was also beautiful. It had a certain harmony. And that harmony, that beauty, was a form of education for us, the education of our highest faculty, our sense of beauty and truth, our sense, our experience of the transcendent. Nature, if you were to meditate, and rishis and the wise saints and the wise men and the Sufis have all meditated upon nature, apart from other things. And through that experience of harmony with nature, they were able to know their own nature. Through that experience of harmony with nature, they were able to experience the transcendent. So the beauty of, the significance of the perennial tradition in terms of their view of nature was that nature, on the one hand, enables us to live in the ephemeral. We are able to function on the earth through our transient lives. But nature, through its beauty, transports us to metaphysical truths, to eternal truths. And so nature enables us simultaneously to live in the ephemeral and the eternal. And it was this dual aspect of nature that was recognized in every religion, in every wisdom tradition, and was lost after the Industrial Revolution in the last 300 years. So in reconstructing a consciousness, a humane consciousness, a consciousness that brings to the surface a defining feature of being human, that is loving care, to be able, in doing that, we will discover a new relationship with each other. The other is no more a threat or an instrument of exploitation. We will discover that nature is not just fragmented natural resources to be exploited, but that nature has to be, it indicates the presence of the divine. So it has a great function to educate us in a higher dimensions of being human. And nature also enables us to physically live. And then when we experience other people as an essential feature of our own growth, and we experience nature as an essential aspect of our spiritual and physical survival and growth, then we'll be able to place commodities in the right context. They'll be merely useful, as the Greeks argued. Through the ages, I mean, even under Hinduism, the word share means an illusion. It has no significance. Then we'll be able to place commodities in the right context. Now the point is that this re-experiencing our consciousness as human beings, the defining feature of being in this world is loving care, in being able to use reason and love in the design of public policy and in the conduct of our own lives, individual lives. That has become, we argued, vital for the survival of life on this planet and building a more humane world in the future. And how will this new consciousness, or old consciousness if you like, the dormant consciousness, be brought to the surface? Education becomes a very, very important part of that process. Whether it is education through the media, or education through universities and colleges and schools, or education by forming small groups amongst ourselves and just discussing things, or relating with each other in a new way, experimenting. Who are we? Getting out of the box, being able to actually look at another person, casting your gaze on the other, and experiencing the beauty of the human being. Just as you can experience the beauty of nature by casting your gaze upon it, its harmony, you can experience the beauty of a human being who contains all the attributes of God, which God has granted in His infinite mercy. And once you recognize that beauty of the other human being and yourself, and understand that that beauty is inseparable from the truth of compassion, then you'll be equipped to build a better world. Building a better world is not just about, is of course about innovation, about understanding based on reason. But that knowledge has to be combined with love. And this phenomenon, this rediscovery of our humane consciousness requires a new kind of education, new kind of educational process. And we attempted to do that in this course, I hope. We're starting that. We ended the course by bringing to bear our knowledge of what is development, development as human development in its broader sense, or sustainable development in its broader sense. We try to design a policy for Pakistan. And I'll end there. We had a detailed policy design for the strategy, but its main feature was, in a sense, a complete turning on the head of the old economics and the old idea of development strategy, which is that we moved away from the idea of growth as being the be-all and the end-all of development, as we had experienced in the 1960s. We began to see development in terms of a process, in terms of a set of institutions, in terms of public policy, it was a process which involved the development of capabilities of human beings. Not only the capability of learning new techniques and skills, but also the capability of loving care, compassion. And we argued that when the potential of a society in terms of the capabilities of each individual are actualized through your political, social, economic arrangements, when the potential of society is actualized, then human beings in that society will become more creative. And when they become more creative, it's not just economic growth will be merely an outcome of that. Sustainable development will be merely an outcome of that phenomenon of actualizing the human potential. What is equally important, what perhaps more important, is that the full flowering of human society, the actualization of individuals, human beings, will enrich human civilization. You'll take civilization forward in terms of its aesthetic, artistic, cultural, political, and economic processes. That is what development is about. We have to move towards what we called human economy. Dr. Khalid Malik and I wrote this article, the human economy. The economy has to, instead of talking about growth, we have to ensure that the economy works for human beings. The economy has to work for the deprived sections of society, for the middle classes and the poor, the bottom 60% of the people. The economy has to work for that, and that's the only test of progress. The test of progress is not what happens to average per capita incomes. The test of progress is the extent to which the capabilities of the bottom 60% of the people are actualized. What kind of opportunities are we providing to them in terms of education, healthcare, social security? So the design of public policy in the specific case of Pakistan, which was fairly concrete, arose out of the more general perception that we tried to achieve of development as human development in all the dimensions of being human. And so it would be development of the people, for the people, by the people. That's the test. I hope we'll take some of these ideas home and for the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.